good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on what ISEB is now offering for pupils in Year 7 and 8, including the new CE specifications and the IPQ. Having not been able to attend any conferences this year, we weren't able to hold our own conference. It is a real pleasure to be engaging with several hundred teachers who signed up for these sessions. We hope that you find this introductory session helpful, and we look forward to seeing you at other events in the coming months. Please tell us what you think of this session so we can build your feedback in as we plan other events for further professional development. For me personally, it's really exciting to see the launch of these specifications. When I became ISEB chair in October 2018, I committed to a full consultation on the future of CE, and I was delighted by the number of teachers from senior and prep schools who wanted to contribute. In what seems now like the far-off pre-pandemic days, it would have been unheard of for such a consultation process to take place without meeting face-to-face. And so we held a series of meetings to discuss CE as a whole and individual subjects. And two key elements underpinned discussions. First, we wanted to address the view that CE was in some way outmoded and focused too much on imparting a huge body of knowledge. Second, we wanted to address the perception that it lent itself to rote teaching. This drew us into focusing squarely on what CE is for. So while retaining a function as an entrance examination, its value lies in providing an opportunity for prep schools to acknowledge what pupils have achieved in Year 7 and 8, and allowing senior schools to know what pupils arriving at the beginning of Year 9 know and understand and can do. And as such, it can provide the backdrop for exciting teaching and fulfilling learning. To ensure this, we began to focus on what we initially called learner profiles. What sort of learners would pupils who had followed the CE specifications actually be? We were perhaps a bit idealistic about this, and at times rather wordy, but a clear consensus emerged, and this showed us what so many teachers see as the value of CE. Over time, these have been refined and condensed, but those of you who were involved in the consultation will recognize the things that we talked about, especially the shorthand of less is more, less focus on what pupils know and more on what they can do with what they know. It's not about knowledge versus skills, but how acquiring knowledge enables the development of skills. And so now we have on the front of all of the specifications a clear indication of what CE is all about. First of all, CE equips pupils not only for the next stage of their education, but for lifelong learning. Many of you will have heard me say before that Key Stage 3 in general and Years 7 and 8 in particular are the last bastion of independence in the curriculum between the tyranny of Key Stage 2 tests and often 3-year courses leading to GCSEs. Whatever is going to happen to GCSEs in the coming years, CE will assist in developing pupils who enjoy reading and are able to articulate clearly, orally, and in writing. And then CE is based on a secure foundation of subject knowledge, concepts, and skills. So while we believe in the importance of examinations, of assessment, of subjects, and of knowledge, we want these to underpin understanding of wide-ranging concepts and skills. This helps pupils understand how subjects connect with each other and to demonstrate cultural awareness and empathy, developing an understanding of their own place in the world. Thirdly, CE encourages pupils to apply what they know to new situations. Applying knowledge and developing skills are essential to growing in confidence and flexibility as learners. Our consultation wanted to make explicit the expectation that pupils should have the confidence to weigh up evidence and make up their own minds, and the resilience to learn from their mistakes. And finally, CE develops enthusiastic learners who are open to new ideas and experiences, who are curious, questioning, and keen to experiment. The teachers we spoke to were proud subject specialists whose motivation was to nurture enthusiasm and open-mindedness. Our specifications should encourage pupils to have the skills to work independently and collaboratively. So in this way, CE is about more than the assessment at the end. In getting to the point where a pupil can perform at their best in these examinations, they will develop as learners, and thus will CE acknowledge what they have achieved and what they know, understand, and can do. But we felt something was missing, something which would allow pupils to apply all this to an area of knowledge not defined by any specification, but generated by their own interests. This is what motivated us to develop an age-appropriate version of the extended project qualification, which we have come to call the ISEB project qualification, or IPQ. We see this as a real opportunity for exciting learning through real research. The IPQ can be undertaken in subject timetabled or homework time, or in off-table timetable time, like after examinations in the summer term of year 7, or after CE itself, or of course as a co-curricular activity. It allows pupils to ask a question that interests them, to research the answer, to amend the question in the light of the research, to reach conclusions and to present those in whatever form they wish, be it an essay, an artifact, a podcast, a PowerPoint presentation, a performance, or whatever. Crucially, it's the entire process which is assessed, and the output is only one part of that. So we think that CE plus IPQ make for an exciting and fulfilling learning experience for pupils and allow for exciting and fulfilling teaching. I think that's probably quite enough about the origins and the thought processes behind it all, the why, the whence, and the wherefore. But it's with great pleasure that I hand over now to our new CEO, Julia Martin, to say more about the how the specifications will bring all of this to life. Julia, thank you.
Thank you very much, Durrell. I really appreciate it. So this school exam dating back to 1904, CE has been established rite of passage for generations. Both Durrell and I remember ours really well, and I've been watching as my own children go through this strange mixture of anticipation, fear, and then that wonderful transition opportunity where they realise that they've got their place at their new school. But recognising how important transition is for young people, our aim is to balance the heritage of this established, well-known rite of passage with innovation. And these new specifications have been developed to retain the underpinning knowledge that CE is known for, alongside the development of key academic skills. These specifications are aiming to encourage teaching and learning that makes the examination a natural culmination of 2 years' study, and develops learners that can apply what they know and they can do to unfamiliar questions, leaving school with a sense of confidence in their ability and ending one stage of their education thoroughly equipped for the next. But of course, CE is best expressed by our subject experts. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Will Law, who is going to talk you through the new specifications.
Thank you very much, Julia. Bonsoir, muy buenas tardes, guten Abend, and a very warm welcome to our Common Entrance Modern Languages Twilight CPD session. My name's Will Law. I'm Head of Modern Languages at Tunbridge School in Kent, and I'm also a member of the setting team for the Common Entrance French qualification. Our wonderful languages setting team is made up first and foremost of professional linguists with a wide range of teaching experience in prep and senior schools alike. And in designing a rigorous and relevant syllabus and assessment model for CE modern languages, we're not only acutely aware of the pressures faced by prep school colleagues, but equally we know the transformative power of a good grounding in languages at a young age. And we share your aims and aspirations for your students as you help them on their way to becoming engaged and engaging global citizens. So let's see how we intend to do that. Although today's webinar focuses predominantly on the more prosaic issue of assessment, it's important that we don't lose sight of this key goal. Because, and this is perhaps our first key message for you, Common Entrance Modern Languages is much more than a terminal assessment. In a subject that puts so much emphasis on looking outwards and beyond one's own horizons, our aim is to mould confident and capable communicators with a lifelong interest in other languages and cultures. We've thought hard about how these values will come to be reflected in our updated syllabus and assessment model, and about the skills we want to develop and indeed anticipate. We've listened to you, to other stakeholders such as senior schools, and drawn on our own considerable experience to develop a course and assessment structure that is distinctive, forward-thinking, and aspirational. A little context then before we dive in. So the German syllabus was last updated in 2013, and the French and Spanish syllabuses more recently. So why the need for change? Well, firstly, it's what you wanted to see. Bringing the three languages broadly in line in terms of format and assessment was important to you and a long-term aim of ours too. Minor variations do still exist to take into account the length of time a language has been studied, but these are designed to be helpful, and we'll be going into a little bit more detail here later. Secondly, the skills that candidates are required to demonstrate have also been reviewed. Modern languages is not a static subject. On the contrary, it's one with obvious and significant real-world application. At the heart of many of the decisions we've taken has been a desire to ensure that today's young people are set up to survive and thrive in real-world foreign language contexts. Again, more in a moment or two on what this looks like in course and assessment terms, but confidence, command of language, cultural awareness, and communication have been amongst our guiding principles. Now, I hope you know this already, but you do a really important job. Please do not underestimate the impact or influence you have as prep school language teachers at this vital cognitive stage in your pupils' language learning journey. We hope that our new syllabus and assessment model allows you to harness the best of your practice and inspire, engage, and motivate. Prep school, after all, is when pupils really start to explore the world around them. Just a couple of years ago, when I was teaching years 5 to 8 in an all-through school, the sense of adventure and excitement in our junior school, as we called it, was palpable. And I still love working with our feeder schools here at Tunbridge to support candidates of all levels. But it's also a time when solid foundations and high expectations are set, and when important transferable skills are developed. You can see some of our key aims here: instilling a sense of adventure, nurturing curiosity, building confidence and enthusiasm. And do please be aware that you'll be able to revisit all of these slides and the whole of this recorded webinar after the event. Of particular relevance and interest to us at the moment are independence and spontaneity. Please don't think that these are the preserve of older or more mature students. Our new syllabus and assessment model aim to develop both in a realistic way and within a supportive framework. As a senior school teacher, I rely on our prep schools to lay good, solid foundations for future progression. It's abundantly clear which of our Year 9 intake have had really positive language learning experiences. The very best students join us with a curiosity for the world around them, complemented by a solid grounding in French, German, or Spanish grammar. They're able to understand simple texts, spoken and written, and compose simple, clear, and accurate written tasks. They have good pronunciation and can use language appropriately in simple transactional contexts. However, we do see students whose knowledge is insecure, or who haven't taken or been given the opportunity to properly embed key structures or language items. These are not necessarily the most obviously lower ability students. In one of its most worrying forms, this manifests itself in students who can, say, drop a lovely subjunctive or pluperfect into their speaking or writing, but whose mastery of the present tense is poor. So another key message, and hopefully a reassuring one: do less, but do it well. Aim for mastery of solid foundations at level 1, with some development and extension at level 2, with a broader vocab base and some key extra verb forms. Extend your best students vertically through the taught core content, and please do leave something for us to do beyond CE. Indeed, this is quite a common question we get. What is, after all, left? Well, as you can see here, the answer is plenty. Firstly, some of the CE themes you're familiar with are developed or extended. Simple interactions, for example, about family makeup, become more in-depth. At CE, this topic, for example, is purely descriptive. Who's in my family? What do they look like? What do they do? What are their personalities like? Thereafter, the focus shifts to family models, relationships, roles and responsibilities, and the process becomes more evaluative and creative. Other new topics are also introduced: social issues, technology, charity, future aspirations and careers, the environment. The list goes on. In terms of grammar, there's plenty for us to cover too. However, as you can see, you provide the invaluable foundations on which this future success is built. Try teaching some of those compound tenses without a good grounding of the present tense, for example. Illustratively, I embarked on the topic of festivals and traditions with my Year 9 class this morning. Their prior knowledge of different countries and types of food and drink meant that we could quickly engage with the topic on a higher level, and after a brief recap that could, had their knowledge not been there, been the stuff of several lessons, we were able to access the content on a much more interesting level. The students too, and this is a danger with a subject like modern languages, did not have the impression of repeating or rehashing old content. Let's have a look now at what we have brought, or how, sorry, we brought our language syllabuses in line for French, German, and Spanish. Now, it's the case that there are two distinct themes, threads, if you like, that run through all of the taught content and are lenses through which the core topics and language items are explored. The first is social interaction, and the second, formal interaction. It's worth saying that most topics overlap both of these themes. So, for example, thinking again about the topic of food, discussing food and meal preferences with a German family corresponds to social interaction, whereas a trip to a German bakery, formal interaction. This shift is designed to be reflective of our emphasis on contexts of language usage. We want you too to help your students discover as much of the real world as possible. Please do continue to root or ground your teaching and delivery of topics and grammar in the context of the countries and communities where the language is spoken. To be clear though, students' knowledge of target cultures will not explicitly be tested, and we do not expect students to display knowledge of linguistic varieties, no Schweizerdeutsch or Narcos-inspired Colombian slang. But we are keen for you to represent the fullness of the French, German, and Spanish-speaking worlds in your teaching. Consider how particular topics or units might align with social or cultural phenomena. Food, through the lens of l'Afrique francophone, a holiday unit based, as it were, in the Austrian Alps, the daily life of a boy in Venezuela compared to a girl in Valencia. Those of you who've been asking, there are still no plans to introduce minimum core vocabulary lists. The most important reasons for that are summarised here, and again, a reminder that these slides will be available afterwards. But just to emphasise a couple of issues. In particular, we want students to develop skills that include coping strategies for dealing with the unfamiliar. Another important part of this decision is that we want the process of delivering this course to be a liberating one for you. in the full knowledge that prep schools allocate vastly different amounts of time to modern languages teaching, preps, etc., we also don't want you to feel constrained. And indeed, as examiners, we don't want to feel that there are certain things that we can or can't put in a particular paper dictated by a vocabulary list. But don't worry, that doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. We will continue to gloss certain unfamiliar words or phrases, especially when we feel that understanding of them is central to the accessibility of a task. But perhaps the principle that underpins all of this most strongly is that we want pupils to develop their understanding of and confidence using cognates, logic, anticipation, and even intelligent guesswork to navigate their way through the unseen or the unprepared. Therefore, working with patterns and adopting a playful approach to language is important. Now, let's talk about assessing what pupils know, understand, and can do. We'll start by focusing on the structural changes to the format of these assessments, and then we'll spend some time looking at how to teach, practice, and embed these skills. Our two-level offering remains for French and Spanish. That's to help both you and senior schools. Level 1 is all about building a base with a degree of challenge in some selected harder exercises. And Level 2 introduces increased challenge and rigor. If this idea of challenge does seem daunting, do remember that it's in no one's best interest to set an assessment in which everyone scores an A star, or for that matter, an E. But we have given great thought as to how this differentiation can be realized in an effective way. We're aware that this subject, more than most, produces a great spectrum of ability. Our papers are designed to discover ability and potential. It's worth noting too that for French and Spanish, there will be no exercise type in the summer version of a paper that has not appeared in either the autumn or the spring series for that year. And as I think you know, the first autumn series for our new syllabus and assessment model will be in 2022, the first spring series in 2023, and both of those are for French and Spanish only, and then the first summer series for French, German, and Spanish in summer 2023. Let's drill now into the content of and changes to each individual skill to see what all of this looks like in practical terms. In reading, we're going to start introducing a wider variety of question types. See some examples here. This is not an attempt to frustrate, but it is to avoid a sense of predictability that we think has started to creep in and allows us to set assessments that really differentiate. The bread and butter of reading skills still remains, though. Whatever candidates are being asked to do in a response to a particular task, there will be questions based on simple recognition of vocab items. For example, knowing the number ocho means 8. There'll be questions based on understanding. For example, that someone who needs to go somewhere dans le train would need to go to the station. And even some based on inference. For example, that a hotel loin de la plage would not be a good accommodation option for someone who likes windsurfing. An understanding of how similar ideas can be expressed differently, including using negation, is important. So cold equals chilly, but also not warm. As previously mentioned, other countries and communities will be used as inspiration for or as the basis of particular texts, whether invented by us or adapted from real sources. Be aware too that familiar topics may be assessed through unusual or unpredictable contexts. Transport and travel via a text on a cultural issue, such as the Tour de France. Or a text about a German Christmas market could be used to assess understanding of numbers. How much was the mulled wine? Prepositions. The cathedral is behind the bakery. Or days of the week. The market is closed on Thursdays. You get the idea. Many of the same core principles apply to the listening paper, as this also tests receptive skills. However, we know that this can be an area of particular anxiety for candidates, given the nature of the exercise and the inability to go back and check content once the recording has been played. To acknowledge this, we'll think carefully about the density of texts and the spacing and distribution of answers within them. Each text will still be played twice, But an important difference in our new style assessment papers is that in multi-part questions, the whole of a question will be played once before it's then repeated. Encourage candidates to use the questions to orientate themselves prior to listening to the recording and anticipate what they might hear. Moving on now to writing, and this slide is just for level 1 in French and Spanish. So there are now 4 exercises. The first is a vocab exercise. Picture prompts will be provided, but any correct answers, whether or not represented in the pictures, will be accepted. A key topic heading or situation will be provided, for example, school or what you could buy at the market, and reasonable interpretations will be accepted. The second part of the level 1 writing section is the grammar sentences. This exercise is really important. A sentence will be given and must be completed using one of 3 options. So in English, an example might be, on Wednesday, the girls playing, plays, play, sport. We're mainly testing key verb forms and things like adjective agreements here. Look out for clues in the sentence. Is one person or is more than one person doing the action? Is the speaker female or male? In section 3, candidates will be given a series of pictures based on a variety of topics and must write 5 to 10 words on each. And section 4 represents a more joined up directed writing task with a choice of 2 topics. Why a sequence then of exercises like this? Well, firstly, there's a little bit more variety, isn't there? It also provides multiple opportunities for success across different task types, and a greater range of topics are covered across a wider variety of communicative contexts replicating different types of language production. Note that exercises 1 and 4 will be based on specific topics, with a choice of 2 topics in exercise 4, whereas the pure grammar sentences in exercise 2 and the pictures in exercise 3 could come from a range of topics. At level 2, and this still just applies for French and Spanish, there are only 2 tasks. Firstly, a sentence translation task in which several topics will be represented. We will provide the masculine singular forms of adjectives, the infinitives of verbs, and the gender of nouns. Candidates must translate the text into French or Spanish, and in French, make sure that the word order is correct. The words we provide in French or Spanish will be in the order that they appear in the English sentence. So, for example, in the sentence, she lives in a blue house, the words bleu and maison would be provided in that order, but would need to be swapped in the final translation. Words not provided may also need to be added, such as articles or prepositions. Section 2, the guided writing task, will take the form of an email. Candidates need to cover 4 of the 5 bullet points provided. Gone are the single contextless words like mi casa, mon école. We'll now be providing explicit guidance on when different tenses can be used. For example, une activité à l'école la semaine dernière. The best candidates will be able to link their ideas to form a coherent piece of writing. Note that it is permitted to use only the present tense in this exercise, but that to access top marks, candidates in French should be able to demonstrate knowledge of past and future tenses, and candidates in Spanish, the future tense. No knowledge of the past tense is required in Spanish. We would encourage candidates to cover the 4 bullet points evenly, so dedicating about 20 or 30 words to each of the 4 points. The best candidates might follow the idea +1, tense +1 formula, i.e. a simple point in one tense followed by an elaboration in another. Normally, I go to school by bus, but last week I took the train. For German only here for the writing section. The first part of the German writing is a sentence translation task similar to the French and Spanish task, with the gender of nouns and 1 key infinitive verb provided per sentence. Separable verbs will be donated by a slash. As you can see here, something like auf/stehen. The directed writing task is also similar to the equivalent French or Spanish task, but in German, candidates will be able to choose when to use particular tenses. So, for example, if the words meine Schule are provided, a candidate might choose to write about their school in the present, past, or future tense, or a combination of these. Finally, on to the speaking, perhaps the part of the assessment that has undergone the most change. First of all, level 1, and again here only for French and Spanish. Firstly, what has remained the same? Well, candidates still have access to a dictionary during the preparation period, and the test will still be recorded. What has changed? Well, candidates can now make notes during the preparation period that they'll be able to refer to during the test, during parts 1 and 2 of the test. The test is now also slightly longer, approximately 5 minutes instead of 4. Diversification of task types is intended to allow candidates to show what they can do and serve the purpose of differentiation. The role play and text-based tasks that we'll look at in a moment aim to replicate and reflect how language is used in a real-world context. So firstly, the level 1 role play for French and Spanish. This has replaced the presentation. We understand that this was often a reassuring task for candidates, a nice opener, but it's also one that generates bad habits, i.e. rote learning of a text devoid of any interaction, and in a way that fundamentally has little real application. I'm still yet to find a French person who's interested in hearing about my daily routine. A role play, on the other hand, reflects usage of language in transactional contexts, and it emphasizes accuracy and clarity of communication. We should say that at level 1, although the candidates do in fact have access to a dictionary, the language required will often be simple. Hello, goodbye, thank you, etc. Another attraction for us of a role play task at level 1 is, of course, that it tests both listening and speaking skills. And candidates will have to listen carefully, particularly in the unseen question. And there's an example on your screen here. All of the level 1 role plays will be based on age-appropriate transactional or social contexts. The present tense will be the main the main tense required throughout, except for prescribed verb forms like I would like. Sometimes 2 verbs will need to be used together, and this is a good opportunity to make sure candidates understand and can use simple sequences of tenses, usually a conjugated verb plus an infinitive. For example, me gusta jugar, quiero comprar, je voudrais manger. 6 of the 9 marks available for this first section are for completion of the tasks and communication of the key points, with 3 marks reserved for quality and accuracy of language. Throughout all of the speaking exercises, at all levels and in all languages, think of the examiner as a sympathetic native speaker, ready to reward good use of language, but equally not over-penalize, especially when small or insignificant errors do not seriously impact on or hinder communication. At level 2, and for French, German and Spanish, the speaking test includes a role play, a text-based task, and a spontaneous discussion. The same similarities and differences to the previous specification regarding dictionaries, note-taking, etc., as mentioned for level 1, also apply to level 2. And the rationale is the same too: a greater variety of tasks that attempt to replicate real-life use of language. If you're a Germanist, an extra piece of information for you here. Note that to bring German in line with French and Spanish, candidates will no longer be given the title area of the topic to be discussed in the spontaneous discussion at the start of the preparation period. The nature of the level 2 role play is very similar in format, aims and objective to its level 1 equivalent. At this level, it can be expected that some of the vocab required may be challenging, but that's where good dictionary skills, to be discussed shortly, come in. The requirement to respond to an unprepared question remains, and so good familiarity with question words is a must. Encourage candidates to answer questions in full sentences with a verb where possible. Right, here we go. One of our major changes and something we're very excited about, the text-based task. The premise of this task is the same at level 1 and level 2, so we'll deal with both at the same time. It's also applicable to all 3 languages. Candidates will be provided with a box in English with a general topic indicated by a title. There's an example here on the screen for French. The teacher examiner will be provided with a list of questions, one for each piece of information that the candidate holds. The key idea here, relatively obviously, is that the text in English serves as a support for the candidates as they answer the examiner's questions. It might seem like a bit of an oxymoron to say that this attempts to introduce an element of controlled spontaneity, but that, in essence, is how we see it. And it also does replicate a reality that we've probably all experienced. We hold information, memories, plans in our heads in our own language, and we transfer them into a foreign language. Each item in the support text box will provide an explicit idea or ideas to be communicated. The questions will be targeted to the way the information is presented to allow the candidate to fulfill the communicative objective. As the teacher examiner, your job is to facilitate this conversation by asking the prompt questions. At level 1, the candidate will have 6 pieces of information, and at level 2, there will be 7 pieces of information. The order of the prompt questions corresponds to the order of the information as the candidate has it. At both level 1 and level 2, the teacher examiner should ask the first and any 4 of the remaining questions. This means that at level 1, there'll be 1 piece of information that remains unused, and at level 2, 2 pieces. The compulsory asking of the first question is designed to provide an element of predictability for the candidate, but also set up the context for the conversation. To help your candidates, we recommend asking the questions in the order given. Though remember that 1 question at level 1 and 2 questions at level 2 should not be used. There may be no supplementary or follow-up questions. Be aware that this is not intended to be a simple translation exercise. The information given to the candidate is provided in English, but also in short form. It needs to be transformed into a targeted answer to a question, which will usually include a verb, except in specific cases. Different tenses can be used, but are not required. The questions that the teacher examiner asks will never explicitly require the use of a tense other than the present. And finally, note that this task is marked for communication only, so getting the point across is crucial. From the candidate's point of view, most of the available marks can be picked up by simple, accurate, targeted responses to the questions. For example, and in fact, I'm going to go back just a couple of slides here to the example that we had there. So for example, here at the bottom, we can see that the candidate possesses the prompt, do not like, visiting museums, and then boring. So the candidate would pick up most of the marks to that question by saying something like, I or we don't like visiting museums because it's boring. However, to access marks in the top 2 bands, and particularly to achieve 7 or 8 out of 8, we do want candidates to be able to provide some supplementary information. This could, for example, be in the form of opinions, descriptions, perhaps using adjectives, adding information about timescales or frequency, or being more precise or detailed than the information provided is. So, for example, here, we can see where we normally go on holiday is Malaga in the south of Spain. But the candidate could add a small additional piece of information, like in a small village or near the sea. If the candidate was asked to talk about food and describe it as delicious, they could add what they ate. If they were asked to describe the weather, they could add an exclamation, how horrible, oh dear, for example. This is one of the ways in which we hope candidates will distinguish themselves. We hope that beyond the specific context of this task, this encourages them to become more confident, adding detail to their speaking and writing. The open and spontaneous discussion part 3 of the German, French and Spanish speaking task is very much what it's always been, not least an opportunity for the very best candidates to show just what they can do. There's no limit on the material that can be covered, except that there must be no overlap with that covered in the first 2 oral tasks. And that means in practice that depending on a candidate's level, everything from one topic covered in great depth to several or even all topics covered superficially is possible. Bear this in mind though, we are ultimately assessing a conversation. And although there can be a fine line between a well-prepared candidate and an over-rehearsed one, there's a gulf between the two in terms of confidence and potential. Equally, we do not understand open, spontaneous and unprepared discussion in this context to mean nattering away in French, German and Spanish completely fluently. We are realistic about this. Don't forget either that to an extent, a candidate's success in this task is in part down to the way in which you conduct the exam. Put them at ease, use questions well, and don't be afraid to move on if a candidate has little to say or dries up. Push candidates to their individual ceilings. It's helpful for us to see a candidate's potential, not just what they can do in their comfort zone. To a large extent, you are responsible for helping us differentiate between candidates in this exercise. Vary your questioning, but think carefully about the question words you're using. Closed questions might be more appropriate for level 1 candidates. Open questions can provide a real opportunity for level 2 candidates to flex their linguistic muscles. The more this can sound like a conversation, the better. Don't be afraid to interject or ask for clarification, or even push a student to give you a little bit more information. As one of the most open sections of the whole assessment, it's important that you, through questioning and conduct, help to push candidates to their ceilings. As you help candidates prepare and in the exam itself, make sure that you give them opportunities to use different tenses if they're able to, give an opinion, etc. Reflect on the idea +1, tense +1 formula we mentioned earlier in the context of the level 2 long writing. It has potentially very useful applications here too. And please be aware of and discourage rote learning or overlearning. It's very obvious and it's not ultimately helpful for candidates. It's amazing how many candidates, even at GCSE level, fall back onto common entrance style preparations when it comes to expounding on certain ideas in the speaking exam. And counterintuitive as this might sound, it is possible to train candidates in spontaneity too. Natural sounding fillers are a good idea, for example, and quite fun to play around with. Encourage students to think too in terms of chunking language. You may have come across or used sentence builders and the like. Humans naturally chunk language and sense units together, and to learn in chunks can help to avoid or mitigate those awkward moments when the mot juste just doesn't quite come. Chunking gives learners options, introduces variety, and helps to develop linguistic flexibility and confidence too. Last but by no means least, how to approach the first year of the new specification. Well, harness the opportunities available to you. As well as more traditional resources, a wealth of online tools and resources exist. Exploit them. It's a wonderful time to be teaching languages. Take advantage too of the natural opportunities to seek out adventure and explore in a subject with real life implications. Enjoy the process of developing what we've termed here linguistic curiosity. Help students to become aware of and appreciate the way in which languages work. Encourage them to become grammar detectives, thinking like a linguist. Put an emphasis on patterns, play with language. Encourage them to make and explore links. With your best students, encourage, when appropriate, an implicit approach to grammar acquisition. And introduce and embed strategies for coping with unfamiliarity that might include decoding, interpreting, anticipating ideas to be covered in listening and reading texts, and so on. Crucial, particularly in the speaking test, but also more generally as students become more confident users of language and build their vocabulary, is the acquisition of simple dictionary skills. There are lots of exercises and drills you can have fun with using a good old dictionary. Work with synonyms, focus on word class and category, and use the dictionary as a gateway to the unfamiliar. Get students to understand how unfamiliar words fit into familiar constructions. The model on the screen now is a good example of how this can be achieved as part of a vocab building exercise. In the speaking exam, during the preparation period, we'd strongly advise against the use of a dictionary for all but necessary words, and encourage candidates to only write down keywords rather than full sentences. Students should also be aware that the dictionary is not always their friend, and there's a good deal of fun to be got out of exercises that attempt to distinguish between synonyms, homophones, etc. Building general language skills, including to cope with the demands of some of the assessment tasks, is also important. In terms of receptive skills, practice reading and listening for gist, understanding, and depth. Show students how to scan texts for key information or detail. Show them how to orientate themselves in a text or in anticipation of a listening exercise by using the questions and predicting what they might hear or read about. As for productive skills, get your pupils as comfortable as possible as soon as possible, developing their language in simple ways to say more complex things. Expanding simple sentences to add detail, as you can see with the Spanish example here on the screen. Pyramid translations, turning positive sentences negative, and vice versa. Transforming a present tense into the past or future tenses. Making a text written by a male I female. In oral work, get pupils comfortable speaking the language. Build some speaking or choral chanting or repetition into each lesson. For practice using language in transactional contexts, use model conversations with segments that can be adapted. Gradually remove scaffolds and reward interest and imagination. And as mentioned several times before, encourage students to spot cognates and identify and play with patterns. In grammar terms, aim for depth of understanding. Remember from near the start of the presentation, do less, but do it well. Make sure your scheme of work acknowledges how students develop understanding of grammar. Ensure that key points are reinforced and that new items learnt are put into practice in receptive and productive contexts as soon as possible, but also in the medium and long term. Focus attention in on specific grammatical items by requiring their usage. For example, in an essay which has a specific form of a verb or an adjective that has to be used. Build natural and instinctive approaches to language that replicate how we use it. We mentioned chunking key ideas just a few moments ago. If necessary, be prepared to be selective. Consider which verbs or adjectives are going to be most useful for the pupils to know and flood them with exposure to them, rather than aiming for greater range at the expense of familiarity. Make sure too that pupils know what different words do. Don't shy away from using and making sure pupils understand grammatical terminology. Make sure they are grammar literate. As for speaking, don't see this as a separate entity. Do it alongside other skills and make sure that speaking is a key feature of your classroom repertoire. Be aware of how other skills complement speaking. Listening, so that questions can be understood. Writing, as pupils develop depth of expression. Start with models, and there's a lot then to be said for playing with phonics and sound patterns too. Choral repetition and reading out loud are obvious but highly effective strategies too. Encourage students to develop a portfolio or repertoire of language they feel confident using, and start to build this up from the beginning. My students, for example, have their own speaking repertoires in the form of Quizlet lists that they add to when they see a nice word or phrase in a text or in a listening exercise. And of course, practice key phrases as they're needed for the speaking exam, like those you can see on the screen here. Simple transactional phrases like I would like, I'm looking for, where is or are something. That's the end of the language specific part, and I look forward very much to taking some questions in a moment. I do very briefly, though, just want to touch on the IPQ, or the ISEB project qualification that you heard about right at the start. There's lots more information about this on the ISEB website, and a recording of the webinar that took place on the 27th of April is also available on the ISEB YouTube channel. The keynote here is that the real value of the IPQ lies in the process of organising, planning and completing an individual project motivated by one's own interests. In modern languages, there are plenty of ways in which this could be explored, and indeed some wonderful potential links, particularly to the cultural enrichment that we mentioned earlier. Some examples are provided here, but note that an IPQ grounded in modern languages could take the form of a project in its own right. For example, an exploration of a person, place, or event, or even the creation of an authentic cultural artifact, for example, a tourist brochure for a town, or a video. The project would not have to be completed in the target language, though elements could, of course, be included. Last but by no means least, there are plenty of resources available already on Galore Park, with some important updates to come on existing French materials, and we hope that Spanish materials may be able to follow in due course. Do please be reassured, though, that the vast majority of what you currently use continues to be applicable. We do not envisage the need to overhaul schemes of work or purchase an entirely new set of teaching resources. Well, thank you very much for listening. I'm sure you'll have some questions, which I'll now do my best to answer. This has been a very exciting process for us on the Modern Languages Setting team, and I hope you can see the practical benefits of the new proposals for you and your students, both in the short run, but also particularly as they look to embrace the multitude of opportunities that a multilingual world brings.
Thank you so much, Will. That was brilliant. So I actually do have some questions that have come in. We did pose questions through Eventbrite before, and we've had a few that came in before the event. One thing I will mention, though, and just to give everybody in the audience time, is if you minimize, if you're on full screen in YouTube and you minimize it, you can see the chat window to your right. Now, if you are signed into Google or YouTube, you do have to be signed in. You will be able to chat with us there, and Will and I will be able to see your questions and make sure we're fielding them. So I have some questions that people have posed to us earlier on in the day through email. So I'm going to start with those. And while you're answering that, I will make sure everybody can see the chat window in YouTube. So Will, from Carl Turner, there's a good question here about dictionaries. Can an online dictionary, e.g. word reference, application be used as a substitute?
Yeah, so just a reminder that dictionaries are being used in the preparation part of the speaking exam only. I think we all nowadays probably turn to an online dictionary before its paper equivalent. However, we are going to be pretty clear that we would like schools to use real physical dictionaries during the preparation period of the speaking exams, and that's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's to help you. We want, or rather we don't want you to have to worry about exam security, setting up a technology in advance of the speaking test, making sure the students have access to a computer that they then won't also be able to use, for example, to access something like Google Translate or other resources. Nonetheless, of course, we would encourage the use of an online dictionary in normal teaching and learning, but actually we suggest that to embed properly the skills that are needed for the speaking exam, also to get into the habit as soon as possible of students being comfortable using real paper dictionaries, and that's what we'd like you to do, particularly in the assessment context as well.
Thanks, Will. Continuing the theme, are there any plans to use passages from literary texts in the reading papers?
It's not something that we're going to rule out. It's certainly something that has now become the case in domestic GCSE qualifications. We may trial that, for example, in French to see how that goes, but please do be reassured that those will always be age appropriate, grammar appropriate, and that they will always, or that they will continue to test or assess relatively predictable vocabulary, themes, ideas, and structures. We're not just going to be dropping, a passage of Maupassant or Garcia Marquez in there. Everything that we use, whatever we use, whether it's a literary text or not, will be tailored to the context, and unfamiliar words or phrases needed to access a task will always be glossed too.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I've got 2 more questions that had come in via email, and then I promise I shall move to the chat. At the ends of parts 1 and 2 of the speaking test, should the notes be collected in? It's a good question.
We'd like them to be, yes. There's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, because at the start of the speaking test, the students won't know what topics they're going to be asked about in part 3 of the speaking exam, and we don't really therefore want them to worry about trying to predict that, or waste time during the preparation period anticipating what those might be, and spend time writing things down that may not eventually be used. Equally, we do want to encourage spontaneity in that task, and we do sort of worry that if students get into the habit of going into the preparation room, writing out a long list of structures that they might want to use, that they might be tempted then to sort of put too much pressure on themselves to overlearn or rote learn long, complicated structures that they may not be able to use in context, or that may not help them to come across in the best possible way during the speaking test.
Great. And the last one from the email: do candidates have to take all 4 question papers at the same level?
They do, yes. We want to create an assessment where all skills complement, reinforce, and enhance each other. And whilst we understand that candidates will have particular strengths or weaknesses in particular skills, we do want candidates to enter the level 1 or the level 2 exam in its entirety and integrity.
Thank you. So we go now to the chat. So thank you to Marie, who starts with bonsoir. May I ask about marking the grammar test part of the level 2? Each sentence is marked out of 2, but they all test numerous grammar points. Is there one that should outweigh the others?
Bonsoir, thanks very much for your question. The approach taken both in the grammar sentence part of the writing, but also actually in the sort of longer directed writing task, is very much an impressionistic one. We don't want you or your students to worry about, for example, having to get a particular adjective or particular tense or particular key idea right, and that outweighing or being more important than something else that they might also need to think about. So we will take an impressionistic view of that marking, and in particular look carefully to ensure that the sort of communicative objective has been met in as accurate and clear and unambiguous a way as possible. But we're not hierarchizing, as it were, grammar points, the particular grammatical features or points in those sentences. Great.
So now we move to Susan, who is very polite. She thanks us for the presentation. You're absolutely welcome. She asks, what will the scope for the speaking exam be? Should the pupils still retain the 4 topics?
So in terms of sort of what can be assessed here and the range of topics that can be assessed, one of the sort of objectives in including a wider variety of tasks that touch more bases is that the students have the ability to demonstrate more of what they know in as many different contexts as possible. As I've said, we won't be asking the students in the open unprepared discussion at the end, so part 3 of the speaking test, to speak on topics that have already been covered during the role play or the text-based task. But there is the possibility, depending on the candidate, that any or all of the remaining topics will be covered in the final section of the speaking exam. In a sense, that's up to your discretion as the teacher examiner. There is nothing wrong, particularly with candidates who dry up or who are struggling to give longer or more developed answers. There is nothing wrong with asking a selection of questions from a wide variety of topics on a superficial level. Equally, this is a wonderful opportunity for more advanced candidates or higher ability to candidates to really drill into a topic. Your management of that task is a really important part of that differentiation process. So there isn't a requirement, as it were, to cover a particular number of questions from a particular range of topics. But of course, the topics that are covered in part 3 of the speaking exam will be dictated by what has come up in the first 2 parts, and so it isn't possible, for example, for a student to anticipate before they go into the exam which particular topics they might face in which part of the assessment.
Thank you. So we have another from Andre. Extra time is available for reading and writing. Is there anything in place to support those with auditory processing delays in the listening exam?
Yeah, so taking into account these sorts of things is really, really important to us, and we understand that it's harder to do so in a listening context, in an exam hall with a CD with a recorded passage. And what we do is we provide the transcripts of those passages to schools. And we ask that teachers at the schools examine those students separately and build in gaps as needed for that particular student according to their particular learning profile in a separate room, and give them over the duration of the whole test any extra time that they might need. It's also important that you discuss with your heads of department, academic lead teams, head teachers, specific requirements for certain pupils, and that those are also communicated in due course to colleagues at senior schools. We're always very, very sympathetic as to any special considerations that need to be made, because it's important to us that those students have the same opportunities as any other, and we will never penalise or discriminate against a candidate for whom special circumstances or a particular examination context needs to be put into place.
Thank you. One from Leila Damaso, who has asked, for the speaking exam, isn't the text-based task quite similar to the role play?
It's not dissimilar, although there are some clear differences, and let's just focus on a couple here now. So both are essentially sort of transactional contexts. They can be either formal or informal interactions, but I suppose the key difference is that the level of elaboration that is appropriate or possible. So for example, in the role play, the students really are asked to and only required to hit very, very specific communicative objectives to deliver the information that is needed, and that's it. So for example, I want to buy a t-shirt, a white t-shirt, a bigger t-shirt, that sort of thing. In the text-based task, and this is why it's the sort of second task in the speaking exam, is that we want the candidates to be able to provide a little bit more information. And I was giving you some examples there back during the presentation, that in addition to the information that they're provided in that original text box, they might also add an extra detail, an exclamation, an opinion, or an example. So it's just gradually through the course of the exam, over the course of the assessment, encouraging slightly more engagement with spontaneity, and also getting them to think a little bit on their feet too. They have the opportunity to be progressively creative and distinctive through the exam, and we think that text-based task achieves that important balance between something that the candidates have the chance to prepare and think about in advance, but also something that they have to respond to with a little bit of with an element of supported unpredictability well. And don't forget that another element of that text-based task is also that they don't quite know which question corresponding to which piece of information is coming at any which point. So in a sense, it serves as a sort of supplementary listening exercise too, and that's not the case in the role play, where essentially they can already predetermine the information they'll need to be provided at every stage, except of course for the unseen question.
Thanks, Will. So at the moment, it doesn't look as if we have any more questions from the floor. I shall pad for a couple of minutes in case we do get any. But in the meantime, I must say thank you to our chair, Darrell, and a huge thanks to Will for taking time out of his busy teaching schedule and also supporting us here at the ISEB for the hard work that he's done. It doesn't look as if we have the last minute question come in, Will. So it's just to say a huge thanks to you. And for anybody watching, it's to let you know that these the slides and the recording of this will be available on YouTube directly after the event. There is also a space on our website where we will put Will's slides, the recording of this event, a copy of the specification, and any of the other resources that are available. So keep an eye out for that. We will be emailing you all directly. So anybody that's registered, colleagues that have registered and couldn't make it, don't worry, there will be lots of opportunities to rewatch it. We are getting lots of merci beaucoup and thank you so much from the stream, Will.
Merci à vous, muchas gracias. Dankeschön.
You've clearly made an impact in more than one language, but we must thank you very, very much. For anybody watching, as I say, do keep in touch. And if you have any specific questions, inquiries at iseb.co.uk, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. So thank you, Will, and thank you everybody for watching.
Thank you for joining us.